My name is Nora. I am 32, and I spend my days organizing data, digitizing physical archives, and ensuring that records outlast the people who made them. I know that humans lie, but paper, if you understand how to protect it, never does. I found out exactly how loudly my family was willing to lie to my face on a rainy Tuesday morning, sitting in a lawyer's mahogany-paneled office. We were there for the reading of my grandmother Eleanor's will. My mother, Linda, sat to my left, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. My older sister, Morgan, sat across from me. She was glowing with the kind of California-tanned confidence that only comes from a person who thinks they have just won the lottery. And to my eldest granddaughter, Morgan, Mr. Gable read, adjusting his glasses and looking down at the heavy cream-colored paper. I leave my primary residence, the Victorian estate in Vermont, and all its contents. The estate was worth roughly $2 million. Morgan exhaled a loud, performative sigh of gratitude, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. "Oh, Grandma," she whispered. My mother patted her knee in solidarity. I didn't blink. I didn't jump out of my chair, and I didn't raise my voice to tell Mr. Gable he was reading a mistake. I just sat quietly and watched my sister's performance. For 5 years, I had lived in that grand, drafty house with Eleanor. I was the one who measured out her medications, drove her to every specialist, and sat by her bed on the long nights when her breathing got shallow. Through all of it, Morgan was 3,000 miles away, building a life on the West Coast and claiming she was simply too overwhelmed to manage even a 10-minute phone call on Thanksgiving. More importantly, I knew for an absolute fact that the document Mr. Gable was reading was a lie. Just 1 month before she passed away, my grandmother had sat at her heavy oak desk, looked me in the eye, and completely rewritten her will, leaving the estate entirely to me. I had seen her sign it. But I didn't say a word. In my line of work, you don't announce a discrepancy until you are holding the audit trail to prove it. So, I folded my hands in my lap, offered a polite, quiet nod, and let Morgan believe she had won. Morgan didn't arrive in Vermont until the morning of our grandmother's funeral. She pulled into the circular driveway in a rented black SUV, stepping out in a designer dress suited for an LA cocktail party, not a graveside service in New England. She hadn't been to this house in 6 years. She didn't know the third stair groaned or how the front door stuck in the humidity. But she knew exactly where Grandma kept her important papers. Because Morgan was always exceptionally good at taking what she felt she was owed. She didn't come alone. Morgan brought her boyfriend, Brad, a commercial real estate agent with aggressively white teeth who looked at historic architecture the way a butcher looks at meat. While we were drinking bitter coffee in the parlor, Brad was pacing the dining room. I watched him pull a digital laser measure out of his jacket and pointed at the molding. He wasn't attending a memorial. He was appraising an asset. He asked me if the original stained glass windows had historical restrictions preventing a rapid flip. I told him I didn't know and walked away. In my profession, you learn to look for the absence of things just as carefully as what is there. I am an archivist. I build systems out of chaos. When I walk into a room, my brain automatically catalogs its contents. So, on the evening after the funeral, when the house was quiet and the last casserole dish had been cleared, I noticed the atmosphere in Eleanor's study had shifted. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke, which was odd. It was mid-May, and the damper on the antique fireplace had been closed since March. I walked over to the hearth and crouched down. Resting on the cold iron grate were fresh, flaky black ashes. Not the dense gray powder of a long-burning oak log, but the fragile, curling remnants of heavy paper. Next to the grate, abandoned on the rug, was a tiny, unmistakable piece of evidence, a small fleck of crimson sealing wax. Eleanor was old-fashioned. She loved sealing her private correspondence with red wax. Just a month ago, when she signed her new will leaving the house to me, she had placed it in a cream envelope, sealed it with crimson wax, and tucked it into her heavy oak desk. I stood up and walked to the desk. The middle drawer was unlocked. I opened it. The envelope was gone. It didn't take a forensic team to piece together the mechanics of my sister's betrayal. While I was greeting grieving neighbors, Morgan had slipped away from the wake. She rummaged through the belongings of a woman she hadn't visited in half a decade and found the document that threatened her payday. She must have opened it, read the clauses naming me as the sole beneficiary, and panicked. She threw it into the fireplace, struck a match, and watched the truth burn to ash. But burning a will doesn't make a person wealthy. It creates a vacuum. Morgan knew she needed something to fill it. That was why she volunteered to help Mr. Gable, our family lawyer, gather paperwork from Grandma's safe deposit box the next morning. Handed him wasn't the document Eleanor drew up weeks prior. It was an old, yellowing version of a will from 15 years ago. Back then, Morgan was a star athlete and the golden child, while I was just the quiet younger sister. That archaic document named Morgan as sole heir. Morgan was convinced her plan was flawless. She had eliminated the obstacle between her and a windfall. She thought she outsmarted a dying woman and her boring, paper-pushing sister. She and Brad were already whispering about contacting a staging company, spending money they didn't have. But Morgan made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed destroying a physical paper meant destroying the truth. She forgot what I do for a living. A modern archivist never relies on a single physical copy. The paper was gone, but the trap she walked into was steel. I wanted to know why Morgan had taken such a massive, reckless risk. People driven by simple greed usually have some patience. They wait for probate, they argue in mediation, they try to contest the will legally with expensive lawyers. But burning a document in a dead woman's fireplace while the mourners were still drinking coffee in the very next room? That wasn't just greed. That was blind panic. That was the frantic, sloppy behavior of someone who was completely out of time. So the night after I found the ashes in the grate, I opened my laptop and went to work. I build databases for a living, which means I know exactly how to search them. Most people think their financial secrets are invisible, but a desperate person always leaves a trail of breadcrumbs in public records if you know which digital rocks to look under. I started with Brad. He had bragged about his commercial real estate firm during the wake, so I pulled the state registry of LLCs. He was listed as a managing partner on 4 different corporate entities. I cross-referenced those names with county court records and federal tax databases. It didn't take long for the successful facade to completely crumble. 2 of his LLCs had active federal tax liens filed against them. I kept digging, moving my search over to Morgan. My sister's pristine California life was held together by nothing more than digital duct tape and high-interest credit. I found a string of highly leveraged loans and a mountain of catastrophic cryptocurrency investments that had completely wiped out their liquidity 6 months prior. They weren't just broke. They were in the kind of aggressive, spiraling debt that attracts serious federal attention. The IRS was actively circling Brad for tax evasion, and Morgan was legally tied to the debt. They didn't just want Grandma's house to buy a new sports car or go on vacation. They needed a rapid $2 million cash injection to keep themselves out of federal prison. The historic Vermont estate was their only lifeline, and they were ready to cut my throat to grab it. Understanding their desperation made them dangerous, but it also made them entirely predictable. Morgan had always underestimated me. She saw me as a boring paper pusher, a quiet spinster sister who spent her life covered in dust in a county basement. She didn't understand that an archivist's entire job is outsmarting time, decay, and human interference. She thought that by striking a match, she had reset the board. She thought the old, outdated will she had handed Mr. Gable was the only legally binding paper left on Earth. She was incredibly wrong. Let me explain something about preservation. A single point of failure is no preservation at all. If a document truly matters, you don't just leave it in an oak desk to be found by the first opportunistic relative who comes snooping. You back it up. You digitize it. You distribute it. Morgan didn't know that on the rainy afternoon my grandmother signed the new will, I had immediately placed it on my high-resolution flatbed scanner. I captured the texture of the heavy paper, the exact lean of Eleanor's cursive, the thick imprint of the notary's stamp. That digital file was encrypted and sitting securely on 3 different remote cloud servers before the ink was even fully dry. But digital copies, while excellent for proving intent, can sometimes invite tedious legal arguments about authenticity. I didn't want to argue with Morgan in court for the next 3 years. I wanted to drop an absolute anvil on her perfectly manicured head. Fortunately, my grandmother was just as sharp and paranoid as I am. Eleanor had spent 82 years on this earth, and she knew exactly who her eldest daughter was. Morgan will try to take it, Eleanor had told me quietly, sitting in her armchair with the newly signed will resting on her lap. She'll come in here like a hurricane and try to sweep you right out the door. I had asked her what we should do about it. Eleanor simply smiled, pulled out her crimson sealing wax, and prepared 2 identical envelopes. She placed a high-quality copy of the will, complete with a real heavy wax seal, into the middle drawer of her desk. It was bait. A perfect, irresistible decoy for a thief in a hurry. Then, she took the real, legally binding original document, the one with the wet ink and the physical notary seal, and she mailed it to a trusted friend. She didn't use Mr. Gable, who was local and easily manipulated by my mother. She sent it to Arthur Sterling, a retired estate attorney living 3 states away in New Hampshire. Arthur held the true original in a fireproof safe, with strict instructions not to reveal its existence to anyone until I gave him the signal. Morgan had burned a piece of paper, yes, but she had only burned the bait. The trap was already set, and she had just stepped squarely into it, without even realizing the jaws were waiting. The day after the funeral, I politely declined Morgan's offer to help me pack my things. I told her I wasn't leaving the estate quite yet, and I locked the heavy oak doors of the east wing, where my bedroom and home office were located. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse her of burning anything. I simply told her that probate takes time, and as a resident of the house for the last 5 years, I had legal tenant rights that prevented an immediate eviction. Morgan did not handle the word no very well. It was a word she had rarely heard in her life, especially not from me. Within 48 hours, she and Brad had completely changed their tactics. They couldn't physically force me out of the East Wing without involving the sheriff, which would have slowed down their precious sale timeline. So they decided to starve me out emotionally instead. Morgan called our mother Linda. Linda has always been a woman who operates purely on optics. To her, Morgan was the beautiful, successful daughter who escaped their small town, while I was the tragic, slightly embarrassing spinster who stayed behind to catalog dusty papers and change bedpans. Morgan knew exactly how to play our mother. She didn't accuse me of being greedy. She played the concerned, heartbroken sister. She told Linda that I was completely unraveling. "It's just so sad," Morgan loudly whispered to our mother on the phone in the hallway, making sure her voice carried up the stairs to my office. "Nora is completely losing her grip on reality. She's so traumatized by Grandma passing that she thinks there are secret documents hidden in the walls. She refuses to leave the house because she thinks it's hers. I'm honestly scared for her mental health." Linda took the bait immediately and ran with it. My mother became the chief architect of my new public reputation. She spent the next week calling every aunt, uncle, and family friend in our town. Her tone was always gentle, coated in that thick, sugary faux concern that people use when they are trying to destroy you politely. She told them I was having a severe psychological breakdown. She said I had become dangerously obsessed with the estate, that I was inventing fantasies about a new will out of pure resentment, and that I was making the grieving process impossible for the rest of the family. The smear campaign worked beautifully. My phone started ringing with calls from well-meaning relatives using soft, placating voices, suggesting I needed professional help or a long rest. When I went into town to buy groceries, the cashier at the local market gave me a look of deep, uncomfortable pity. Morgan and Linda had successfully painted me as the crazy, bitter sister who couldn't let go of a house that didn't belong to her. Then came the escalation. Linda knocked on the locked door of the East Wing on a Thursday afternoon. I opened it to find her standing there with her arms crossed, flanked by Morgan. Linda didn't look concerned. She looked exhausted and annoyed. "Nora, this has to stop," my mother said, her voice sharp. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family. Morgan has the will. It is legal. It is final. If you don't start packing your boxes by Monday, I'm going to call Dr. Evans and have him evaluate you. We will have you declared incompetent if we have to. We are trying to do this the easy way, for your own good. Don't make us do it the hard way." They stood there, waiting for the outburst. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry and beg and insist that a new will existed, so they could look at each other with sad eyes and confirm that I was, indeed, completely insane. They wanted an emotional reaction they could weaponize against me. I have spent my entire career managing fragile things. I know that when you are holding something delicate, like the absolute truth, the worst thing you can do is shake your hands. So, I didn't give them a single tear. I didn't defend myself. I looked at my mother. Then I looked at my sister, whose eyes were bright with anticipated victory. "I understand your position, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and flat, devoid of any heat or panic. "I will be out of the East Wing on my own timeline." Then I quietly closed the heavy oak door in their faces and locked it. I walked back to my computer, pulled up the encrypted file containing the digital scan of the real will, and drafted a very short, very precise email to Arthur Sterling in New Hampshire. It was time to let Morgan think she had won the war, just so I could invite her to the battlefield of my choosing. If there is one thing I have learned from studying historical frauds, it is that arrogant people cannot resist the urge to show off their cleverness. They never just take the money and disappear quietly into the night. They have to throw a parade to celebrate how incredibly smart they are. For Morgan and Brad, that parade took the form of a ridiculously pretentious, pre-market viewing party, held right in the main foyer of my grandmother's estate. By the following Saturday, my sister was completely convinced she had won the war of attrition. Because I had retreated to the East Wing and remained entirely silent against her smear campaign, she assumed I was defeated, busy packing my bags in tearful humiliation. She and Brad hired a local catering company to serve expensive champagne and miniature crab cakes to a hand-picked list of wealthy out-of-town investors, elite real estate developers, and a few of our nosiest local relatives, including my mother, Linda. They wanted to generate a massive bidding war before the house even officially hit the market. The sheer audacity of hosting a high-end open house while the legal resident was still living down the hall was staggering. But Morgan operated on the assumption that if you act like you own the room, people will simply believe you do. Morgan was holding court in the grand living room, wearing a tailored white suit, gesturing expansively toward the original crown molding and the antique chandeliers. Brad was stationed near the grand staircase, handing out glossy, professionally printed brochures that estimated the property's value at well over $2 million. And right there, sitting on a velvet-draped pedestal in the center of the room like a museum exhibit, was the will. Morgan had actually placed the document in a temporary glass display case. She wanted to head off any rumors I might have spread about her legal right to sell the house. When investors asked if the title was clear, she would smile her dazzling, predatory smile, point to the glass case and say, "Oh, absolutely. My grandmother left everything to me explicitly. The paperwork is ironclad. We just wanted to be completely transparent with our buyers." I decided to leave the East Wing and join the party. I didn't dress up. I wore my standard archivist attire, a simple gray cardigan, dark slacks, and quiet shoes. When I walked into the living room, the conversation dipped into an uncomfortable, heavy hush. My mother shot me a warning glare, her eyes darting toward the investors, as if praying I wouldn't have a public mental breakdown and ruin Morgan's big day. Morgan stiffened, gripping her champagne flute so tightly her knuckles turned white. But I didn't make a scene. I simply smiled pleasantly, took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, and walked directly over to the velvet pedestal to examine the document my sister was so incredibly proud of. It was the old will, the one from 15 years ago. But Morgan and Brad had encountered a problem when they originally submitted it to Mr. Gable. A 15-year-old will, while legally valid if unrevoked, often invites heavy scrutiny from probate courts and title insurance companies, especially when a massive estate is being liquidated rapidly. To smooth the path and make the document look like a recent, final reflection of Eleanor's wishes, Morgan had done something incredibly stupid. She had altered it. She had used a remarkably good chemical solvent to lift the original date and carefully typed over it using an antique typewriter she probably found in a local vintage shop. She changed the date from 2009 to a crisp, recent date just 2 years ago. To the untrained eye, or a lazy real estate investor drinking free champagne, it looked perfectly legitimate. The paper was appropriately aged, the signature was genuinely Eleanor's, and the typed date made it look like a recent confirmation of Morgan's inheritance. But Morgan is not an archivist. She doesn't understand that a document is a delicate ecosystem. When you change one element, you have to ensure it aligns perfectly with the historical reality of every other element on that page. As I stared down through the glass, my eyes bypassed the forged date and landed directly on the notary public's seal at the bottom of the page. It was a faded blue ink stamp, accompanied by a sprawling, loopy signature. Thomas H. Vance, Notary Public, State of Vermont. Morgan hadn't altered the notary stamp because she didn't think she needed to. The stamp simply validated the signature. But in her haste to fast-forward the document's date by over a decade, She had created a massive, catastrophic temporal paradox. You see, my job requires me to verify the provenance of local historical records, which means I spend hours in county archives. I knew exactly who Thomas H. Vance was. He was a prominent local accountant and notary for over 40 years. And I also knew, with absolute certainty, that Thomas H. Vance had died of a massive heart attack on a golf course 3 full years ago. Morgan had proudly displayed a supposedly legally binding document dated just 2 years ago that bore the physical signature and official ink stamp of a man who had been completely dead for 12 months before the paper was supposedly signed. It wasn't just a fake. It was a federal crime, sitting under a literal spotlight. I stood there for a long moment, memorizing the specific details, letting the sheer, beautiful perfection of her mistake wash over me. Morgan marched over to me, her voice a tight, furious whisper. "What are you doing?" "Get away from that. You are embarrassing yourself." I looked up from the glass case, meeting my sister's panicked, angry eyes. I didn't yell. I didn't point out the dead man's signature to the room. I just took a slow sip of my sparkling water. "It's a fascinating piece of history, Morgan," I said, my voice entirely calm and entirely honest. "You should be very proud of your work. Enjoy your party." I turned and walked back to the East Wing, leaving her staring after me in total confusion. I didn't need to break up her little celebration. The trap was fully sprung. All I had to do now was invite the people who could legally close the jaws. An hour into the pre-market viewing party, the atmosphere in the grand living room was electric. Brad was practically salivating as he walked a pair of developers through the architectural merits of the sweeping mahogany staircase. Morgan was standing near the fireplace, holding a fresh glass of champagne, soaking in the admiration of our mother and a few local gossips who had come to see the estate. The forged will still sat proudly under its glass dome, catching the light of the antique crystal chandelier. Morgan looked completely untouchable. That is exactly when the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. I didn't wait for the hired catering staff to answer it. I walked out of the East Wing, crossed the marble floor, and pulled the heavy door open myself. Standing on the porch was Sheriff Miller, a man who had known our family for 30 years, and right beside him was Arthur Sterling. Arthur was a sharp-featured man in his late 70s, carrying a battered leather briefcase. He looked exactly like what he was, a highly expensive, uncompromising estate attorney who did not have time for amateur hour. "Afternoon, Nora," Sheriff Miller said, removing his hat. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, but his eyes were sharp. "Are we ready?" "We are," I replied, stepping aside to let them in. The moment the sheriff stepped into the foyer, the lively chatter of the party began to evaporate, dying out in concentric circles until the entire ground floor was submerged in a tense, breathless silence. Investors exchanged confused glances. Waiters froze with trays of appetizers. Morgan's smile faltered, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the stem of her flute. "Nora," my mother hissed, her face flushed red with embarrassment. "What on earth is the meaning of this? Why are the police here? I told you to stop this nonsense." I didn't look at my mother. I didn't address her at all. Instead, I walked directly into the center of the living room, stopping right next to the velvet pedestal where Morgan's forged documents sat under the glass. I pulled my tablet from under my arm. Brad had set up a massive smart TV over the fireplace earlier that morning to loop a drone video of the estate's sprawling grounds. I picked up the remote, switched the input to screen mirroring, and connected my tablet. "Excuse me, everyone," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in that dead silence, it carried easily to the very back of the room. "I apologize for the interruption. Before any of you sign letters of intent on this property, there is a matter of clear title and legal ownership that needs to be addressed immediately." "Turn that off," Morgan snapped, her voice pitching up in panic. She lunged toward the television, but Sheriff Miller stepped neatly into her path, holding up one massive hand. "Let her finish, Morgan," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of the law. Morgan froze, her eyes darting frantically to Brad, who suddenly looked very pale. I tapped the screen of my tablet. The drone footage vanished, replaced by a crisp video of my grandmother. Eleanor was sitting at her heavy oak desk. The video was time-stamped exactly 32 days before her passing. A collective gasp rippled through the room. My mother brought a trembling hand to her mouth. On the screen, Eleanor looked directly into the camera. Her eyes were bright and utterly lucid. "My name is Eleanor Vance." Her recorded voice echoed through the room, strong and steady. "I am recording this video to accompany my final, legally binding will. I have left my entire estate exclusively to my granddaughter, Nora. She has been my sole caretaker and my true family in my final years." On the screen, Eleanor picked up a cream-colored envelope, sealed it with crimson wax, and then held up a second, identical document. "I know my eldest granddaughter, Morgan," Eleanor continued, her voice turning cold. "I know she is deeply in debt, and I know she will try to steal this house. I expect her to search my desk, find the copy of this will I have left there, and destroy it. Therefore, I am sending the legally notarized original out of state to my attorney, Arthur Sterling, for safekeeping. Any other document presented by Morgan is outdated, invalid, or fraudulent." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute. Morgan was shaking. The blood had completely drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin some desperate lie, but her throat just clicked. Arthur Sterling stepped forward. He unlatched his briefcase, reached inside, and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. The heavy, unbroken crimson wax seal gleamed. He didn't say a word. He just handed it to me. I placed the original will directly on top of the glass dome, right above Morgan's forgery. "This is the original will," I said calmly. Then, I pointed a finger down at the document inside the glass case. "And that is a 15-year-old revoked document that my sister chemically altered. She typed a new date over the old one. Unfortunately, she forgot to check the notary public's credentials. The man who supposedly stamped that document 2 years ago actually died 3 years ago." I looked directly at Brad, who was currently backing away toward the front door. "Forging a legal document to initiate a real estate transaction across state lines," I said to him, keeping my voice mild, "is wire fraud, and attempting to pass off a forged will in probate is a felony. I believe the sheriff has some questions for both of you." The immediate aftermath of exposing a massive lie is rarely a spectacular explosion. It is usually a very rapid, very cold deflation. The moment I said the words wire fraud and felony, the atmosphere in the grand living room transformed from a high society cocktail party into an active crime scene. Wealthy real estate developers and out-of-town investors are incredibly allergic to federal investigations. I watched as 3 men in expensive tailored suits simply set their champagne glasses down on the nearest available surfaces, turned on their heels, and walked out the front door without saying a single word. Within 90 seconds, the only people left in the room were my family, Arthur Sterling, Sheriff Miller, and a catering staff that looked terrified to even breathe. Brad was the first to completely crack. All of his slick, aggressive charm evaporated the second Sheriff Miller took a step toward him. "I didn't know!" Brad shouted, his voice cracking as he backed away from Morgan, holding his hands up as if surrendering to an invisible army. "I swear to God, I had absolutely nothing to do with that document. She told me it was legal. She did all the typing. She bought the solvent." It was a breathtaking display of pure cowardice. He didn't even hesitate to throw the woman he supposedly loved directly under a fleet of buses to save his own skin. Morgan stared at him, her mouth hanging open in shock, the ultimate betrayal hitting her square in the chest. Sheriff Miller didn't look amused. "Well, Brad, since your name is on the brokerage agreements attempting to sell a property with a fraudulent title, I think the federal investigators are going to want to hear all about that solvent. Both of you, out to the cruiser. We have a lot of paperwork to go over down at the station." Morgan finally burst into tears. The real, ugly, gasping tears of someone who finally understands that the bill for their arrogance has come due. She looked frantically at our mother, begging for a rescue. Linda took a step forward, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Nora, please," she whispered, her voice completely stripped of all its previous condescension. "She's your sister. You can't let them take her away like this. We can fix this. We can keep this in the family. You have the house now, just like you wanted. Please, don't press charges." I looked at my mother. I thought about the phone calls she made, the vicious rumors she spread, the way she stood outside my door and threatened to have me committed to a psychiatric facility just to clear the path for her favorite daughter's payday. "I am not pressing charges, Mom," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a metronome. "The state of Vermont is pressing charges. The federal government is pressing charges. Forging a legal document is not a family dispute. It is a felony. You spent the last 2 weeks telling the entire town that I was unwell and needed to be managed. It turns out I am the only one thinking clearly. The door is right behind you." Linda opened her mouth to argue, but Arthur Sterling stepped in, his presence as solid as a brick wall. "I suggest you leave the premises immediately, ma'am," he said smoothly. "My client has exclusive legal claim to this estate, and your continued presence here, given your complicity in attempting to enforce a forged will, could be legally actionable." My mother looked at me one last time, searching for a trace of the weak, compliant daughter she thought she knew. She found absolutely nothing. She picked up her designer purse and walked out the door, her shoulders slumped, the illusion of her perfect family entirely shattered. Here is what happened in the months that followed, because the aftermath of the truth is always more satisfying than the confrontation itself. The probate court recognized Eleanor's true, original will immediately. The forged document was handed over to the district attorney as evidence. Because Brad had crossed state lines to solicit investors using fraudulent documents, the FBI and the IRS both opened intensive audits into his finances. The heavily leveraged house of cards he and Morgan had built completely collapsed. Brad's LLCs were liquidated to pay off federal tax liens, and Morgan is currently awaiting trial, facing years in prison for her amateur forgery attempt. They gambled everything they had on a lie, and they lost spectacularly. As for me, I changed the locks on the heavy oak doors the very next morning. I didn't sell the house. I kept it exactly as Eleanor intended. I converted the massive, sunlit, formal dining room into a state-of-the-art archival and digitization studio. I spend my days doing what I love, taking fragile, vulnerable pieces of history and locking them into permanent, undeniable digital preservation. Sometimes, when the house is perfectly quiet and the afternoon sun hits the antique chandeliers, I walk over to the fireplace in Eleanor's study. I look at the clean iron grate where my sister thought she had burned my future to ashes, and I smile. People who lie loud always underestimate the people who tell the truth quietly. They think that because you aren't screaming, you aren't fighting. They don't understand that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs a patient archivist, a secure backup, and the willingness to let the facts speak for themselves. The foundation I stand on now isn't just made of Victorian mahogany and stone. It is built on airtight evidence and quiet justice, and it has never been stronger. That is my story. A burned envelope, a dead notary, and a quiet sister who kept her receipts. If you have ever been the person your family underestimated, the one they thought they could steamroll because you don't like to cause a scene, let this be your sign. You don't have to raise your voice to win. You just have to be right, and you have to be ready. Protect your peace, back up your documents, and let their own arrogance be their downfall. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Raw Drama Stories. If Nora's methodical victory brought you a sense of peace today, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who might need a reminder to stand their ground. Drop a comment below and tell me, what was your favorite moment of the confrontation? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of quiet, elegant justice. Until next time, stay strong and keep your receipts.